Okay,
Oh yeah.
so I didn't run through my subject to be presenting today for y'all, but consistent with the field of computer science, we have ourselves a little lesson on cryptography, which would be the art of obfuscating messages for online communication and a number of other methods. Here I'm going to be teaching you about some basics of a little bit of the math behind it, and there's going to be a little bit of information on why your own password security is important and how you can make things a little bit better for yourself in that regard. So, cryptography is a mathematical process in which you obfuscate a message that you send online. We are past the day of sending a secret message inside of a steel truck that can't be broken open through violence. Instead, we have to hide our messages in plain sight by scrambling them and disguising them using certain algorithmic math processes. You'll see this most often where all of y'all, since this is an online stream, y'all should be familiar with entering in your passwords in for websites and how they make you go through a few more hoops these days. But it's also important for banking, like those of y'all that might have debit cards with the little electronic chips in them. That also employs a lot of cryptography. And the origins of cryptography come from military communications, and those are important enough dating back to even ancient times, having a lot of changes happening with the invention of computers around the middle of our last century. In fact, cryptography is so important that there are a number of world governments that actually restrict civilian use of it. Simple idea here is that we have a message that we're wanting to encrypt. There's a bunch of different methods for it, but just for an initial idea here, we have Alice and Bob, who are our two stock communicators that we'll be using as names. With a simple message such as "Hello, Bob," we'll be using an encryption algorithm which outputs a sequence of a bunch of characters that don't seem to have any particular meaning on their own. And then when that's given to Bob, he has the method necessary to decrypt it and get the original message back. The reason why we're actually doing this is it's a favorite subject of mine, and this is actually where my namesake for my VTuber comes from. Alan Turing being a very, very important person to the field of computer science, and according to many, pretty much the founder of the whole subject. He was very important in World War II, in which he assisted in cracking the ciphers used by the German military, which caused a bunch of critical battles to be succeeded for the Allied powers. The Enigma machine you see on the right is a cryptography device, which Alan Turing helped to decrypt the ways that a lot of the German soldiers were disguising their messages. I think he's a very particularly important fellow, and the reason why I have his name as mine is in honor of him. And I consider computer science to be pretty much the big thing I love most. So, the way we do encryption algorithms is it has to be a very specific mathematical process. We can handle messages that would be in plain text, such as letters and such, but we can encode those using numbers and other mathematical operations. Usually we'll have an encryption algorithm and then an inverse decryption algorithm. These are going to be two math processes that are slightly different from each other, but should be able to accept similar inputs and be able to scramble a message and then unscramble it accordingly. The reason why cryptography works is due to the computational hardness assumption, in which as the data you work with gets larger, the time necessary to brute force open it up is going to get larger proportionally. So, with many of the algorithmic processes that we have these days, the harder your message is to crack, it's not necessarily an idea of making it impossible to crack, but by making it so computationally difficult that it will take an impractical amount of time and or energy to crack it. A lot of these kind of come down to integer factorization or discrete logarithms, which are very easy processes to understand, but difficult to solve with brute force. Essentially, if you have the keys necessary to encrypt and decrypt, they are very, very quick and easy mathematical processes. But without that information, you take a very, very long time to figure out through brute force how to deal with any of them. A lot of this will actually come down to the use of prime numbers, which is one of the more interesting things about the math here. All the numbers you see here are prime numbers, in fact, and by cryptography standards, these are actually incredibly small. So the number you see here, that is not a small number. That is a big number, but that's still nothing compared to what modern cryptography standards use. What this is not actually a prime number itself, but it is the product of two separate prime numbers down here. The way a lot of common cryptography works with asymmetrical keys, the numbers that you see above Alice and Bob here are their each individual private keys. Whenever they need to send a message to each other, using a specific encryption algorithm, they can use their individual private keys, which will create a scrambled message. The number up here is the public key created by multiplying these two factors together, and you need this public key to decrypt it, but you can only get this number through the application of the two private keys here. So, for example, Alice, going back to her original idea, could be sending the hello Bob message or anything else, and then would use her private key, this very large prime number right here, and would encrypt the message using that. Sending the message to Bob, he does not use Alice's private key because that is hers that only she should recognize, and that isn't going to be shared with anyone. But what Bob does is he uses his corresponding key, and through applying that, you get a mathematical process which will come out to using a public key, and then that math multiplied by the message will get you the original decryption of the original key. The reason these are important with the two prime factors here is as numbers get larger and larger, you potentially have more factors to them, so primes become difficult to find. And with the way a lot of the math involving multiplication, division, and modulo operators work, you need large prime numbers once you get to the stage because you can cut down on computational time for numbers that are not prime. So, it's very difficult when you get a number like this to figure out exactly what two prime numbers factor together into it. That's part of the integer factorization of the computational hardness assumption. No one's figured out a good way to just get two raw prime numbers out of getting a much, much larger number that's composite of just those two. So Alice and Bob here are able to communicate because they both know one part of the equation, and then they can multiply those two together when they're exchanging information. We've got a couple of example algorithms. I know that's a lot of really, really big math that we're starting with there. What the heck happened there? I know that's a lot of complex stuff, so we're going to start with something simple for a cipher. That should be easy to understand. We'll be passing our test sentence of the fish was delish and it made quite a dish, and I'll be giving y'all a couple of examples for it. I talked about how the origins of cryptography often came from military applications, and until the invention of the computer, there weren't really complex ciphers that civilians could use. So it was often reserved with very, very difficult processes for military use. Though, way, way back in the olden days, we have one of the easiest to understand and earliest ciphers in the shift cipher, also called the Caesarian cipher because it was known to be used by Julius Caesar. We don't particularly have method or much of a historical record on how easy it was to actually crack these, so much as we know that these ciphers were used and the ideas were common back at that time. Julius Caesar would often use a shift cipher of about 3 letters, which for the message that we have here, the original, the plain text here, every single letter in the message just needs to be shifted over 3 points into the alphabet, which gives us this message down here at the bottom. And then whenever someone needs to decrypt the message, they'll apply the inverse algorithm, which is just shifting 3 letters in the other direction. Now, a cipher like this is easy to understand, and I've even seen elementary school kids play with it on the playground because it's something that easy to get. But it is by no means a secure cipher due to data analysis and how letters are distributed. Looking down here at the message right here, it would be very easy to figure out the original message due to certain trends in the ciphertext that we have here. You'll see that with fish, delish, and dish up here, those frequently create the same 3 letters of the LVK, LVK, and LVK down here. And by analyzing letter frequencies, shift ciphers like this are not in any actual professional use anymore because it's way too easy to crack these. It takes less than a second. Block cipher is going to be a little bit of a step up from there. And I was originally trying to put the binary numbers on here, but those took up the entire page. So I'm going to explain a little bit of a demonstration here. Taking our plain text, we will use a key which it's displayed as a number here, but a lot of the data that we have can be concentrated down to a key right here, which is used to determine how a plain text is broken apart and then rearranged. The fish was delish and it made quite a dish here would be reorganized into its binary components for each letter. And then by using a mathematical process, usually an XOR function, comparing bits to each other and then changing the output bits according to what we have here on our key, which can also be changed into its own binary statement. That ultimately will create a very, very long obfuscated string here, which it's harder to detect patterns in here because of the way that the original text has been scrambled through here. With our previous idea of the Caesarean cipher right here, there's the issue of patterns being easily detectable in here to make it easier to crack. With a block cipher, it's a little bit more difficult because the individual letters here end up getting scrambled with each other when they are broken up into binary. And guess I could try to give y'all a little demonstration here of just how large that number would be. That is a 64-bit statement right there, and if I went into 64-bit to binary, you can take a large string like this and it ends up coming out to a very large binary sequence over here. And so each of these are the individual bits that end up getting put through a process with the original message to get our ciphertext. And similarly enough, using that similar key and applying the same mathematical process in reverse, we can take that ciphertext message, and only if you have this key, which is the private part of the message that you need to decrypt this, then you can get the original plain text out of that. Going a little bit further, we have hash functions, which are very interesting because they can take data of any length and they will output a hash, which is going to be similarly a string of characters, but it will output a fixed length. So no matter how large of a message you put in here originally, after being put through a hash function, it will output a, in this case, 256-bit hash, which will be completely unique to this input data, with a few exceptions. The important thing about hash functions is you cannot get the original input back out of them. With a lot of other sequences, such as our ciphertext that we had for the block cipher and for the shift cipher, the size of the ciphertext can be roughly indicative of the message needing to be sent. As the message gets larger, so will the ciphertext that's sent with it. The hash function is essentially a one-way process, and the important distinction about it is that a very, very small change in the input data can create a very large change in the output data. Here we have that same hash being put out here with our little hash algorithm example. So if we change any of these letters, say just add another letter in, we'll get a completely different output, which while it will be the same length, it's going to be completely different even if you just change, for example, one letter. The entire string is going to change. Hash functions are important because they can be used to securely store passwords on a web server without storing the password itself. When you give your password to a server that's asking for it, they can instead store the hash and compare the hash that they have to the hash of any future password attempts. And from that hash that they have stored, if there was ever a security breach, you cannot directly get back the original password that was given to them. And you can use this for other things such as programs, like if you download other programs to work with and you're suspicious that they might contain a virus but don't have any obvious indication from the outside, you can even put entire programs into a hash function. And if any of the data in there is just slightly different, you will get a completely different hash. This is a 256-bit hash, which has an incomprehensibly large number of permutations. We don't have just numbers in here, but you'll see we have a few other letters in here. This one is put into hexadecimal, which will use letters 0, 1 through 9, and then A, B, C, D, E, F, because it uses 16 characters. There's an extremely large number of ways that this hash can be written. And for smaller data sets, there's not going to be any two inputs that are going to create the same output. Issue is, it's still a finite amount, so when you eventually get extremely, extremely large data sets, things that can't even be contained within, say, a Google, for example, there may eventually be collisions of two inputs that can create the same output. But over time, we have been getting larger and higher number of bits for hash functions. You'll see the 256 here. We used to use 128 and 64. As time goes on, there may be a need for even larger hash functions to be able to contain the amount of data that can be put through. But anytime you're needing to check something without being able to get the original data set back, you can compare two very similar sets of data, and if they do not produce the same hash, then they are different. The important part about all of this is Google Slide's still trying to destroy me. Password entropy is what a lot of this is getting down to. You'll see how we end up having a lot of similar passwords to less secure encryption with the examples we had before here, and then getting to hash functions here in which we can't even get the original input, which makes it a lot more secure. For a lot of other potential data sets, there have been a number of server breaches over the past few years. With every company, they're going to have a slightly different way of handling their encryption, and some of them are going to have security holes. So whenever you're going to need to hide from a cyber attack, you're going to want a message with a lot of entropy. Given that passwords themselves do not explicitly have to be messages for you to communicate, you just need a unique set of characters to ensure that it's your own identity. High entropy passwords are much more important than low entropy passwords. Entropy being essentially a mathematical measurement of how much randomness you have in a computer set of data. If you have a longer password, you have more potential for different characters, so that's going to increase your entropy. I know y'all have been on websites, and I'd say starting about maybe 12 years or so ago, just about every website starts asking you for lowercase and capital characters, using a few numbers, using special characters. Those are all bits that increase entropy even further for both the inclusion of all the strange symbols that aren't letters, and using lowercase or uppercase randomly. Some people who are very, very bad at passwords, and most websites won't let you get away with it, will end up using the very simple and obvious things of just single words or number sequences. These are incredibly easy to crack, and if any of y'all have any passwords roughly resembling this, I'd recommend after the whole symposium, go back and try to change them, please. Most passwords are probably going to look like this at some point, usually an easy way for a human to generate a decent password whenever they're signing onto a website. A lot of people will be writing something in leak speak, and these are going to be okay. Most websites will enforce this as a minimum. Some of these are going to be very easy to remember and understand just by applying, okay, I can swap a few letters in with these numbers here and there. You get to use a couple of special characters that might be a bit more difficult to guess. But when hackers are looking for your information, they are going to be looking for patterns. That's why we use large prime numbers. That's why we scramble things completely wildly with a different pattern from what the original text is. Because the easier it is to detect patterns in the passwords or whatever message you're trying to send, the easier it is to get closer to finding the original message. If someone's going to be trying a lot of different methods to hack into or intercept your password, and they eventually come across something that's looking like leet speak, it's going to be a lot harder to get than any of the simple plain text passwords here. But the instant there's any noticeable pattern, all of it goes out of the window and it becomes much easier to solve. This is why strong entropy passwords are important, because whenever you get to a message like this, you have no idea if this is the actual text you're looking for or if it's just more random garbage. Whenever you're putting in a password to a website, I recommend, at least for some of your most important ones, try to use a password generator or a password keeper to let you use very long sequences as long as the website will take from you, and just give it a whole bunch of random crap like this. Not even generated by yourself, because humans tend to have a lot of biases of making their own passwords with some very distinct patterns, alternating uppercase and lowercase, having a bias towards using some numbers in case of some letters. So you do want your passwords to look like this for any of your online accounts. If any of y'all don't have passwords scrambled up like this, I'd recommend making those changes. That's the important thing to use, is that all of your passwords should have a very, very high entropy to them. Never use the same password twice. Make it completely different per website. On top of all this, even if some of those passwords are crackable, there's other security methods that people have been using, such as multi-factor authentication. I'm sure a lot of y'all have run into situations where an employer or a website requires, or at least asks you, to link a phone number with your account to use multi-factor authentication. That alone is way more secure than any of these super scrambled passwords, because it's far less likely that someone will have both your password and your phone. If you get to the point where you're breached with someone having possession of your electronic devices and your passwords, then your situation is going to be like this in the XKCD comic on the right. You've got a lot bigger problems than a stolen password. Cryptography nerds, this was actually a comic made shortly before the invention of cryptocurrency. They can talk about having a super, super large RSA encryption algorithm, 4,096 bits, which is going to be orders of magnitude larger than the 256-bit hash functions that we used. It could essentially take millions of years to crack a password like this. But ultimately, if someone wants a password, there's going to be physical danger with that. And Having the basis of multi-factor authentication is going to be a lot more secure because it's a lot more difficult to crack things from two separate places at once, more than just the single password itself. So even if you have trouble keeping track of a lot of passwords, some of us are going to have dozens upon dozens of different accounts, at least for some of your important stuff like your email or your bank accounts. I recommend in every case that you can, set up your multi-factor authentication and give very strong entropic passwords. Any questions, y'all?
Thank you, Xander. So yeah, for those who don't know, after any presentation, we're going to be having some time just to have chat, and anybody here. Man, Ekelus is zooming.
Wait, yeah, sorry.
I'm hearing the engine revving.
Yeah, a
He's over
motorcycle
here.
just passed by.
Me on my way to set up two-factor authentication.
Exactly.
But yeah.
The full clapping sound effect. There we go. To
Yeah,
answer Toto from earlier, adding the little angry smiley face, if you append that, or even better, fit that in the middle of your passwords, it would technically make your passwords a little bit more secure, just having a few extra special characters. The more garbage you cram in there, the better, because you're not trying to send a message, you're just trying to generate a unique key to identify you and only you.
Yeah. Yep. But for people who can't, I don't know, use password management, isn't better to use a long password and like a sentence than do scramble things, because a very long sentence, it still will be hard to crack by brute force, won't?
Oh, whoops, that's not the exact spot I was looking for. There we go. I knew this question would exactly be happening. And you can similarly get larger amounts of entropy if you have a larger space to put in characters. There's an XKCD comic also about this exact issue where they talk about a decent entropy password here having a bunch of randomness. This is difficult for someone to remember because they can scramble together some of the
Yeah.
zeros and O's, some of the other characters. And a password of this length is not going to be very difficult to crack. So you do still want an even larger password than this. However, if a hacker is deliberately trying to attack you, they are going to apply a lot of heuristics first. Technically, you still have a decent amount of entropy with, say, just using regular words like this. If someone's trying to brute force it from starting from, is 0 the password? No. Is 1? Is 2? They'll come up to these quicker, but hackers at this point know to look for certain types of attacks or certain types of passwords. If your password is made out of a lot of words and you have a longer sentence with a lot of entropy just from having more stuff in here, it will be a lot easier for you to remember. But hackers are capable of doing things called dictionary attacks, where because they know the prominence of this idea, when they're trying to search and crack for passwords, they're going to try a lot of leet speak kind of combinations first and a lot of real words. They're going to start, of course, with any of the most common and obvious number sequences. But then they will move on to stuff like this and not directly just try to brute force random characters. Because technically, if they were brute forcing starting from 0 and just counting up, they would actually pass through a number of these strong entropy passwords first, because these are essentially random garbage. So doing this is not quite as secure as the XKCD comic might lead you to believe. It might have been a lot more secure at the time that the comic was originally written, but because of the prominence of this idea, you can give yourself a very easy password to remember. But the larger entropy here is a bit less relevant because hackers know to try something like this first before they get to something like all of this garbage. Passwords like this are okay if if you're using them for somewhat less important accounts, like, I don't know, maybe if you gaming accounts that aren't connected to a bank or some obscure little website gotcha game passwords. But for anything super important to you, anything tied to your money or individual identity like your email or your bank, even something like this would not be good enough. You would want something as long as this, but still a whole bunch of this garbage, because this is going to be attacked a lot later than any of the heuristics that look for just dictionary words or leet speak first. Hackers at this point are not going to start from 0 and go all the way to 100. They're going to pick all the most common ideas first.
Okay.
I do have a question myself related to account security. 'Cause this is something that has come up before in my talks with students that I talk about, and I want to make sure that I'm not off base on it when I tell them. Those common sort of viral memes that go around where it's like, your Pokemon type is the street you grew up on and your birthday, or your Hogwarts house is the name of your first pet and the street you grew up on. Are those basically social engineering attacks because those are the most common password retrieval questions?
They can be, and I'm glad you actually brought up the password retrieval as well. If you possibly can, and I know this is completely counterintuitive to that idea. If you want extra security, even if it's something like they ask for your mother's maiden name or your name of your first pet, stuff like that. It's counterintuitive, but if you can also put high entropy garbled passwords in there too, and have a good place that you can remember those outside of what you have on a computer, say, if you're secure enough in your home computer that you can just have even something written on a notepad and stuck into your nightstand, that's going to be a lot more secure. Those little figure out your Pokemon type or your, I hate that this is the first thing, the first example I come up with otherwise, your porn star name, stuff like that. Those can be social engineering attacks, but if they don't have the data to specifically attack your account, if they don't have your account name and other passwords like that, it's still going to be a little bit difficult, but I would recommend avoiding answering those questions honestly. But even better than that is for any of those websites that ask for that specific kind of data. Just give them even more strong entropic garbage.
Perfect. Thank you. We do try and do things in health class like help students understand how to protect themselves online, their personal information. I do have a question in my chat from Hard on Eggs, wanting to know about password managers that generate strong passwords. Are they good enough?
One of the most important things from computer scientists is don't roll your own crypto, which is ultimately a statement that you yourself probably don't know enough about cryptography compared to a company that specifically handles it. There are I'm not going to name any of them specifically, but there are a number of companies out there that try to build specific cryptography stuff. Some of them will host VPNs for you. Some of them will host password managers. They, given that they're hinging everything on having an entire team of cryptographers, if you can get a cheap service to have someone manage your password, even some browsers will have it included for free. That is generally going to be a good security method for you, because password managers themselves are going to have their own difficult to solve cryptography. And even the information that they'd store on your computer, for example, would be encrypted by them from what was made by essentially an entire team whose job it is to make something difficult to crack.
Thank you very much. Hard on Eggs says thank you very much as well.
You're very welcome, Hard on Eggs.
I did actually want to pose a question of my own, which is, do you know much about, like, I've been hearing recently about developments in quantum resistant cryptography since quantum computers render traditional private key, public key cryptography invalid?
There are developments towards quantum secure type of computing, quantum secure encryption. The original computational hardness stuff that I talked about at the beginning here. A lot of common things are like RSA are going to be based off of the difficulty of integer factorization and discrete logarithm. But if your cryptography does not focus specifically on these kind of math problems which become easier to solve by quantum computing, they can still be secure. There are a number of them. In fact, I think the hash function that we are using here might also be quantum secure. So we'll have to use different math, but it's going with anything like this. Cybersecurity is an arms race. So as one part becomes easier to crack, people will come out with new methods to make things more secure and even safe against quantum computing type attacks.
The interesting thing about quantum cracking is that governments have actually been stockpiling data, encrypted data, specifically so that once quantum computers get good, they can crack them with quantum computers.
Exactly. The big thing about all that is while we'll still be able to protect ourselves from quantum hacking in the future, a lot of old data that has already been stored and encrypted is all going to be just completely easy to break by that point, which would be why those governments are hoarding all that data. All the old stuff's going to be easy to crack open.
Avid wanted to ask, genuinely, is there advice on actually remembering your more complicated passwords?
You still will want to have very high entropy passwords regardless. And as simple and weird as it is, if you do have a physical location that a lot of other people are not going to have access to, having a notepad with a bunch of passwords on them should be okay. There's a couple of heuristics, like if you have a password specifically for a website, you can get yourself a very entropic sort of garbled password, but keep it with a list of a whole bunch of other super messy passwords, because people aren't going to know which ones correspond to which. But if you give yourself a little heuristic like, oh, I'm going to pick a very specific scrambled password in which, oh, let's say it's my password for Google. Well, I'm just going to remember that out of all of these super scrambled passwords I have, the third letter should correspond to the website. And you should generally be able to recognize kind of a pattern in a very large scrambled password like that. So if you want a Google password specifically that is very highly entropic, give yourself a little personal rule that you remember in your head of, oh, it's going to be the one in which the third letter is a G. And then out of your physical list of passwords, you remember that's the one that you can use. If you can recognize enough of a pattern in a scrambled random password that you gave to yourself, and you can recognize enough of it that you know which website it's going to correspond to, then that'll be easy to take care of. Or like Stella saying in the chat here, using a password manager can also help. Thank you very much for that